Hello, everyone. Let me welcome you all to the upcoming special series of the Geostrata's podcasts with young expert groups in partnership with the BRICS Youth Energy Agency. The BRICS Youth Energy Agency brings together young experts on various energy aspects. Through these young experts, the BRICS Youth Energy Agency sets hypotheses, conducts consultations, and delivers policy suggestions. Furthermore, the expert group members are young individuals representing universities, businesses, academia, and research centers, as well as governments. In the very first edition of the BRICS podcast series, we have with us Ms Hoor Ali, a member of the IPPA Expert Working Group and a COP28 Youth Climate Delegate. And we are going to converse on the importance of youth participation in tackling the effects of climate change and the crucial role which different youth organizations across the world play by engaging in productive partnerships with the UN, its agencies, and among themselves. Now, I welcome you today, Hoor. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah, how are you?
I'm also fine. Thank you for asking. Now,
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for this invitation.
okay. Now, before we delve deep into the details, could you help us understand what the IPPA working group is and what is its driving goal?
So first of all, I want to mention how I first got the chance to engage with BRICS YEA themselves, as in like how I got the exposure to this extensive network of young people that are working on this very extensive research. So last year, I was part of the organizing team of Student Energy Summit 2023. And I was in one of the workshops. It was about generating goals and basically goals within the energy sector. So it was like this hands-on workshop and everything. And one of the people beside me, he was talking to me, he was telling me about like his own experience, where he came from and all of those things. And he mentioned that he was part of BRICS YEA. And I was very much interested because that same year, the UAE joined BRICS. So for me, it was something that was very relevant. It was something that I wanted to know more about. And as Arseni from BRICS YE was telling me more and more about it, I was interested in joining it, perhaps, or maybe also just reading the publications and the outlets that they have. So it sparked in me this eagerness to want to know more about it. So I went on, I Googled it, and I found that they have a couple of publications, a couple of outlets, some of them that were like yearly based on how we're currently working on it for different working groups, and some of it were focused reports. So I found it, to be honest, really inspiring because everyone's doing this out of their own passion and out of their own love. And I would say this is one of the main goals that we want, as in like, how do we bring people together from all of the BRICS countries, and how do you ensure that all of their perspectives are included in this report? How do you ensure that the IPPA working group brings in all of those perspectives together? So first of all, we wanted to acknowledge how, for example, Egypt was a new country that joined BRICS, the UAE was a new country that joined BRICS, Ethiopia, Iran, all of those countries. And how do we bring all of that in within a concise report that brings in all of those perspectives together? Because we don't want to have a 100-page report that no one is going to end up reading, but you want to have something that's concise, but at the same time, you get the depth that we want to reach. So when we're talking about international partnerships and policy advocacy, how do we ensure that between those countries, there is sufficient policy advocacy, and how to ensure that we bring them sort of to the same level between all of the BRICS countries? Because if they all come to the same level, you could see how they would be moving together, they would be progressing together. And those are things that we wanted to look more in.
Right. So I think the enthusiasm that the young people have when they are focused on bringing about change in something that we are already seeing in the IPPA working group, as you've already mentioned, is like it's immense, right? Now, how would you describe the working group's association with BRICS Youth Energy Agency?
So in simple terms, basically, you could imagine it as like BRICS YEA or BRICS Youth Energy Agency at the top. And then under it, there is a report, the 2024 Outlook report that is going to be published. And then under that Outlook report, there are different working groups. So IPP is one of them. Energy transition is another one, health is another one. There are, if I'm not wrong, 6 working groups. We can double that later, يعني, because I'm not 100% sure. But basically, we're a working group under BRICS YEA. So what we want to do is just make sure that we're working along other working groups, that it's not like a separate report fully on its own, but rather along the other working groups. So how to ensure that we're all on the same track again. And then also I see international partnerships as basically something that brings all of those ideas and thematics together, as in like advocate for those policies. How do we ensure that they are going on? And then one thing is that with each working group, we're sort of working with the same timeline. So there is a chief expert, there is a secretary for each working group, and there are members that are working under it. And what we want to ensure is track with that. So in some cases, we're submitted in a timely manner. In some other cases, we needed, for example, some extensions because people are working from different time zones. People are working from different backgrounds and they have different commitments. So how do you ensure that this on that? So it's basically split up into 3 main parts: the introduction, the major trends and scenario analysis, and then finally the recommendations and conclusions that we come to. And what we want to is feed that into the BRICS Energy Outlook for 2024.
Right. So these all working groups under the BRICS Youth Energy Agency work on different topics, but they are sort of working under an umbrella entity which consolidates all the research and the recommendations and tries to bring about fruitful policy recommendations. Right. Now, can you shed some light on how IPPA facilitates the translation of BRICS youth research into tangible policy outcomes? What criteria or methodology does the group follow in this process? Because you've mentioned that all these working groups work under the energy agency and are working towards fruitful negotiations into policy frameworks.
I think, to be honest, this is such a nice question because we like even within like climate spaces and like all of those environmental spaces and energy spaces, as youth, when you're in there, it's like sort of what do you get out of that and what do you give within that? And then when like the main part of your question is how does that translate like into BRICS objectives? How does it translate into BRICS values and how does it go on? So I would say, like, again, like the point that I mentioned earlier is that I see international partnerships and policy advocacy as sort of the core, because you could have recommendations from all of the other working groups, but then it comes down to, do you advocate for that everyone's on board? Because I could have an amazing policy recommendation that, for example, I could argue that it's going to cut carbon emissions by like 50%, 70%, like amazing numbers. It could be amazing. But how feasible is that for all different countries that we're talking about? How is that feasible for all different countries at stake with us? Because even when you're talking only about BRICS countries, there are countries in Asia, there are countries in Africa, there are countries in Latin America. It's basically, how do you ensure that it tackles what all of those countries are wanting to achieve? How do you ensure that it tackles the current stance at which each country is in? So it comes down to sort of evaluating the policy recommendations that we're going. We could go on later about like specifically what policy recommendations we are doing, and then also what major trends that we have done. But basically, it's important to see how do we want to weigh the cost and benefits of the things that we're proposing to ensure that the policy advocacy that we're doing is effective and that people are going to be on board with us. On board, we could have one country on board with us, or we could have 10 countries on board with us. Friends with that. So how to ensure that we have as many countries that come with us as we can.
So yeah, as you've already mentioned that it is very important to walk the talk actually, because when you are advocating for climate change policy recommendations, you have to make sure that it is feasible for all the nations which are on board. Like we have to bring all the nations to the table so that they can agree on one thing which is feasible to everyone. Like it doesn't hurt anyone's interest, right? We can't go tomorrow morning and say that everyone has to like abandon coal suddenly, right? We can't do that. We have to make sure that the energy transition is just and is in a feasible order, right? I think that's a very good approach by the working group to make policy recommendations cater to different nations as per their needs. Now, given the near existential crisis we face due to climate change, right, and that the major decisions across the world are taken by people who have immense experience in their fields, they are running businesses, they are running governments and organizations. Why is it crucial for the IPPA working group to prioritize youth-driven advocacy efforts within the UN and other prominent international platforms? And like, how does this approach contribute to shaping policy discussions?
This is very important to tackle because again, we're working under the Youth Energy Agency, so it's very important, I think, to tie back to the title of the group, to the title basically of the organization itself. So first, I want to go into the major trends that we focused on in our report, and then I'm gonna focus totally on like youth groups and the UN and how liaisons can be done between them. So some of the major trends that we worked on were just energy transition partnerships, and under that would come youth participation in energy, sustainable financing, bilateral partnerships between different BRICS countries that are present, and then the food, water, and energy nexus, advocacy on international platforms such as the UN and other international organizations that have extensive networks. And then we have engagement with youth-led organizations and networks. And then the integration of technology such as like AI, blockchain, and emerging powerful tools, because I feel with how AI is present now, it's something that you can't not mention, basically. And finally, we have international partnerships in terms of global migration trends, because the world is changing. There are so many demographic changes that are happening as a result of the climate crisis that is happening currently. Floods are happening in some countries. People need to flee to other countries. So that is something that we have to ensure that we tackle, because say a flood happens in a country, its neighboring country would sort of have the spotlight, as in like, are they taking in people from the other country that had people affected? So how do international partnership dynamics work in terms of that? And then specifically in terms of youth. So what we wanted to focus on is how do we basically harness the potential of sustainable development, as in youth from BRICS countries and the global South countries are seen as this pivotal stakeholder, I would say, in sustainable development. So how do we empower them and support them by different means under the UN, for example? So what we were analyzing was, for example, the youth program under the UN, the youth climates, basically the youth climate program of the Secretariat of the UN, and basically how we could leverage on that. So what are the benefits, how inclusive it is, and all of those things. And then also how do we provide tangible opportunities and inclusive measures for youth. So basically, like with the global youth population rising in developing countries, it is important to see how could we provide tangible opportunities for youth. So there are many youth that have their own startups, that have their own ideas. So how do we leverage on that? And then we could see, for example, how the UAE, one of the BRICS countries, under the Arab Youth Center, has this program that is called youth pitches, for example, and youth can come and pitch their ideas and they could get seed funding for that. So how do we ensure that such programs are heard by people from the global South and from the increasing and growing population of youth in the global South? So this is one thing that we want to achieve. And then enhancing representation and inclusivity, because we wanted to basically look into how could we increase the presentation of youth in BRICS Plus. So how are they present? And for example, other assemblies such as the UN General Assembly and then in the World Health Assembly. So how could we ensure that youth have an increased presence in that? And then again, coming back to the point that I mentioned earlier, is leveraging on youth-led organizations and networks. For example, there is the MENA Youth Network. There are other youth networks that are in Latin America. There are other youth networks that are only in the Gulf. So how do we build bridges between all of those things? So when you're talking about the MENA Youth Network, it entails youth from BRICS countries that are in Africa and that are in the Middle East. And then when you talk about youth organizations in Latin America, some of them entail youth from Brazil. So how do we make it in a way where you're connecting all of those things? And BRICS YE itself is doing such a thing, because for example, in our working group, we have presentation from all different BRICS countries. So this is one thing that we sort of want to achieve, and it was achieved in basically under BRICS YE. And we want to ensure that this is achieved among other youth organizations and youth networks, basically. And then it comes down to the leadership and advocacy, as in, how do you empower youth? Because when youth are present, for example, in conferences such as COP, they are present, but what are the tools that they can use for them to influence policy, to learn from it, to get more and to get the most that they can in terms of that? So those are things that we're analyzing as well, as in, like, for example, youth that come from different programs to COP, how do they engage with that, and does it differ from country to another? And then models for effective youth inclusion. So we're looking at the No-Fee program in Egypt. We're looking at the International Youth Climate Delegates program in the UAE, some other youth programs from Brazil, especially that COP30 is going to be hosted in Brazil. So how is Brazil working on that? So all of those things were things that we wanted to highlight, were things that we wanted to know more about, wanted to analyze more, and I think we really got like fruitful outcomes from it. Like I myself learned a lot from reading about those things.
Right, like actually, as you already mentioned before, that the sheer enthusiasm that the youth show in something that they are indulged in is humongous, and which is exactly a crucial reason why youth should be included in all these policy decision making, because actually they are the future. They will see the 2070, 2080s, right? The people who are already 80, they won't see the 2080s or 2090s. We have to make sure that we have the jobs, like we have to make sure that we have livelihoods. We have to make sure our communities survive. So it's extremely important for youth to be a crucial part in this process from across the world. And when youth from different nations join hands together for their own national needs, as per the national needs, working towards a single goal, it really makes a good impact. Now coming on to the IPPA working group, in what specific ways does the working group aim to advance the collective goals of sustainable and equitable energy solutions on national as well as international levels through its collaboration efforts and advocacy initiatives?
So this is basically what we're currently working on, or the stage that we're currently at in terms of the report that we're working on for international partnerships and policy advocacy. So we're at the stage of the recommendations and conclusions. So we did our introduction. We introduced what each BRICS country is doing in terms of IPPA. We did our major trends analysis, and then we did scenario analysis where we had different scenarios. For example, what would an increased youth inclusion in international platforms be? How, like, well, what would that look like now? What would that look like in the future? And for example, how would decreased youth inclusion look like and lead to now and in the future? So under those scenario analysis, we sort of got to imagine what are the things that we would need more of, what are the things that could stay the same. So what if the number of youth participants in those platforms stays the same? So it was an optimistic scenario, a pessimistic scenario sort of, and then one that is basically like the same level as it is now. So how would that look like? And after doing those scenario analysis, after discussing it with different members, we sort of came with a couple of recommendations that we wanted to work on. And the main ones are enhancing coordination between various BRICS countries, and then also increasing cooperation and ensuring that BRICS countries are working on the same level in terms of their policy advocacy, and basically looking into means as in how could they help each other in terms of that. So how do we facilitate those multilateral cooperations? Because you're not talking about one country, you're not talking about two countries, you're talking about like a couple of countries, like a handful of countries. So how do you facilitate this cooperation? Because it's not easy. Like there are countries that are across continents, across thousands of kilometers away. So how do you ensure that? And that could be done by, for example, like organizing international forums, workshops, conferences, which would like encourage the group to exchange best practices in those cases, as in, this is what we're doing, this is what you can do, this is what we're doing, this is how we can help you. So sort of how do we leverage on what is happening? And then in terms of policy advocacy, in terms of working with government and international bodies to basically work on those policies and regulations. And then also, how do you provide the evidence-based policy? Because we wanted to know like what is working, what, for example, India is doing, what are partnerships that are, for example, present between India and South Africa. How did those happen? How they work? Those were things that we worked on in the major trans part, and we wanted to leverage on them. So, for example, when you're talking about, let me just go back to it so I remember the proper name of the partnership. Yeah. So, for example, again, like you're talking about like a partnership that happened between India and South Africa. What led to it? Why between those two countries specifically? How could that happen between other countries? What are the outcomes of it? So all of those things are things that we need to analyze, because if we're recommending the same thing, if we're recommending a similar MOU that is signed between all BRICS countries, we want to know what were the outcomes of it if it already happened, and what could be the outcomes of it if it was signed among all of the BRICS countries. So you just could like see how there are like so many nuances that come with each thing that you are thinking about, that come with each addition that you're thinking about, that come with each recommendation that you're thinking of adding. And then there was capacity building, as in how could IPPA group advocate more for capacity building initiatives to empower youth in BRICS countries. And this could go under training programs such as the International Youth Climate Delegates program, such as sort of connecting youth networks, climate and energy youth networks with government bodies. And basically those are things that are going to enhance basically the communication between youth networks and governmental bodies, and sort of strengthen them and empower them basically. And then how to improve inclusive participation, as in the solutions that we're proposing, how to ensure that they're equitable. The point that I mentioned earlier, the one that you mentioned as well, as in like how to ensure equity is still present between all of those things, and that diverse voices are still heard, are still represented in formulating those energy policies that we're proposing. And finally, how would financing some of those proposals work? If we say that we want, for example, a conference that brings together BRICS countries, and we want to have youth representatives in that. So where does financing come from? Where do all of those like things come together basically? And then monitoring and evaluation, which is a crucial part of any policy recommendation that you have, because without monitoring your policy, it could be the like most amazing policy out there, but then without monitoring it and without establishing a proper framework for it, for monitoring and evaluation, it could not go in the direction that you're expecting it to go in. And basically, what we want to work on as well is sort of provide indicators, as in this is what we want to achieve. Like our recommendation is enhanced communication between BRICS countries. Okay, so for example, this is one of the recommendations. So how do you establish indicators that there is in fact an increase in the communication between BRICS countries? So those are also things that we need to take into consideration. But yeah, basically with all of those like collaborative efforts and advocacy initiatives, what we aim is to create this coordinated approach in a way for global energy challenges and the transition that is needed in terms of sustainable energy.
Right, as you rightfully mentioned before, that multilateral forums and collaborations between different nations is a necessity. Because given the diversity that we have on Earth, each country is capable of contributing to green and renewable energy sources in different ways. Like, for example, India is spearheading the International Solar Alliance. Like, right, our Prime Minister has also started this One Sun, One Grid, One Earth initiative to sort of bring a collaboration among different nations who are getting more sun hours every day to enable a solar powered energy supply to the world, right? We can have solar power plants in India, which contribute to development and electricity supplies to maybe nations that are small, like maybe Sri Lanka, maybe Nepal. China can harness its hydropower energies, right? South Africa can harness its wind power. Now, these collaborations can actually help all these nations transition from coal or fossil fuel based economies to non-fossil fuel based economies in a very short period of time once there is a set strategies to implement, right? Now, before we wrap up this interesting conversation, how would you highlight your role in all of these things that we have discussed as of now, and what sort of learnings have you had along the way?
To be honest, one of the main things that really inspired me about working on this report and being part of BRICS YEA this year was how, for example, I myself, I'm a student, I'm a bachelor student studying social research and public policy. But then around me, like the people that are in the working group are also students. Some of them are master students, some of them are PhD candidates, some of them are currently employees and they're working. Some of them have their own startups, for example. So each and every one of us has their own sort of life, has their own commitments, is very busy to be honest, yani. But everyone's putting in the time, putting in the time, putting in the energy, putting in the effort to brainstorm ideas, to work on this report together. Because yeah, like this, to be honest, was the most inspiring thing for me and the thing that really motivated me to continue working. Because even with the meetings that we would host together as a working group, some people are from the other side of the world, like the time zones are completely the opposite, but they would still put the effort to stay up late or wake up early in order to join the meeting. They would put in the effort to put in their input onto the document that we're working on. So it's those things that have really inspired me along the way. And it's this dedication that I learned. How dedicated could you be to something that you're passionate about? And then I would say, like, on a final note, it's something that you mentioned yourself earlier, and it's that many of the goals that we see, like they're in 2050, 2060, 2070, like they feel very out of reach. It's just me currently living in 2024, if you tell me 2050, I can't imagine how life could be, you know? So it feels a bit out of reach. So one thing that I try to remind myself while working on such research, while reading some net zero strategies, is that this is something that we're working on from now, from today, from this day, from this hour, from this minute and second, basically. Like it's something that you could start now. And a 2050 net zero strategy is not going to magically happen when 2050 comes, but it's something that you start working on from now, from 2024, from this day again. So how can you as an individual start working on that? So if of the pillars of the net zero strategy were increasing the amount of pedestrians on street, was increasing the amount of cycling on street. So how can you basically be part of that? How maybe could you reduce the food waste that you contribute on a daily basis? How maybe using the stairs instead of taking the elevator could be something that you could do to reduce your carbon footprint. So it's sort of like one thing that I wanted to do was ground myself in the present. How can I contribute in the present? And this was something that has really helped me because, like, many times when I'm in those climate spaces, if I'm at COP, it just feels out of reach. It's countries and talking to each other, and it's sort of like we want to come to a resolution, but how can I, as Hoor in that specific room, make a contribution? That is something that I want everyone to be aware of. And yeah, if I have like one message to every listener to this podcast, this would be it.
Isn't it right that it all starts with a dream, an idea which people follow, right? And you also mentioned the philosophy of existentialism when you put emphasis on an individual's effort in bringing down their own carbon footprint, right? So I think it's very important for the youth of today to understand all these things and to make sure that they walk the talk. They don't just write articles from the racy rooms, but they also uphold all these principles in their personal lives as well. Uh, Thank you so much, Ms. Hoor, for joining us today and having a discussion on such an important issue. We are looking forward to more such conversations leading to fruition in future. Thank you all who are watching and listening to us. Stay tuned for more such important conversations.